My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 33 years old. I hold a rank few ever reach and lead operations that never make the news. On paper, I barely exist. But in the silent wars fought in digital shadows, I'm one of the few trusted to hold the line. I'm standing in a sea of polished dress blues and ceremonial whites, the weight of my plain navy blazer suddenly suffocating. Around me, the Coronado Base Auditorium hums with anticipation, rows of crisp uniforms, shiny medals, and perfect posture. Pride and patriotism in their most tangible forms. My family is seated just a few rows ahead, whispering excitedly about my younger brother Zach. Today is his day, the day he earns his promotion to lieutenant in the Navy SEALs. The Donovan name is about to shine again, and I'm supposed to clap, politely smile, and slip out unnoticed. They think I'm just Claire, the dropout, the girl who tried the Navy and gave up, the one who now hides behind sensitive IT work and avoids questions at family dinners. I hear the whispers. She's a little delicate. Something about security clearance, but really she's probably tech support. What they don't know is that I've spent the last decade in shadows. They couldn't imagine building digital fortresses, dismantling cyber-terrorist networks, and rewriting threat response protocols for the entire Pacific Fleet. I've commanded teams that operate in absolute silence, where one keystroke could prevent the next global catastrophe. My name, Colonel Claire Donovan, doesn't exist to them. It never has. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm a decorated intelligence officer, the youngest ever promoted to lead our Black Ops cyber division. And I'm still disappointed, still the question mark at holiday tables. The truth has always been too heavy for them, or maybe too inconvenient. I remember the last Christmas I spent with them. Zach had just finished his second SEAL qualification round, and Dad poured him a whiskey like he'd just returned from Normandy. They spent the evening rehashing training stories, the kind that start with, "You wouldn't believe what my CO said," and end in roaring laughter. I tried to share a small win. A policy I'd authored had been adopted by 3 allied cyber units. Before I finished my sentence, Mom gently touched my arm and said, "That's great, sweetheart, but this is about Zach tonight." As General Mark Sullivan walks to the podium, my pulse quickens. He and I know each other far too well. He owes me his career, he just doesn't know I'm here. I shift my weight, keep my gaze down. Not yet. There's a moment, a fraction of breath before a name is spoken, when everything still belongs to secrecy. I've lived in that space for years, wearing anonymity like a second skin. But today, I feel the edge of it slipping. Because today, the wall between the Claire they tolerate and the Colonel they never believed in is about to collapse. Let them hear it. Let them see. This time, I won't apologise for who I became when they weren't looking. I still remember the day I was promoted to Colonel. It happened in a steel-walled operations room deep beneath a joint intelligence centre. No ceremony, no clapping. Just a quiet nod, a digital signature, and a new badge slid across the desk. I held it in my hand, feeling its weight, a silent recognition of every sleepless night, every line of code I wrote when no one else believed in what I could do. Ethan, my husband, was the only one I told that night. We toasted with burnt coffee, sitting side by side on the fire escape outside our safe house. "You know they'll never understand," he said. I smiled, bitter and warm all at once. They don't have to. But now here, I'm not so sure, because part of me does want them to know. Not to boast, not to gloat, but to stop hiding. To be seen, even if only for a moment, in the full, unfiltered truth of who I've become. I glance at Zach. His back is straight jaw, firm the image of everything our father hoped for. I'm proud of him truly. But as I look at him, I also wonder, will he still see me as just Claire after today? Will any of them? There's a hush now. General Sullivan has reached the microphone. He begins to speak, his voice smooth and ceremonial, but my ears are roaring. My hands are cold. In a few breaths, everything will change. My life, carefully constructed in the shadows, will intersect with theirs, and there will be no going back. For the first time in a long time, I am not afraid. I'm ready. The Donovan name stretches like a banner through generations of naval glory, clean lines, crisp uniforms, and eyes that never blink in the face of duty. Our family tree reads like a Pentagon personnel file. My grandfather, Rear Admiral Thomas Donovan, was a World War II submarine strategist who outmaneuvered enemy fleets like it was a game of chess. His medals hung above the fireplace, shielded in glass, as if even dust dared not insult his legacy. My father, Admiral Frank Donovan, served with the same jaw-clenched intensity. 32 years, 4 theatres, 2 wars, decorated, revered, and so steeped in military tradition that he ironed his socks. His shadow loomed over every dinner table, every handshake, every son's first salute. But the Donovan Code of Honour wasn't carved for daughters, not daughters like me. In our home, women existed on the sidelines, respected only insofar as they supported the real warriors. My mother, Lillian, was a master of that art. She wrote letters with scented stationery, organised care packages with surgical precision, and smiled dutifully through ceremonies where her name was never called. She once told me, "You don't need to be in uniform to serve." I didn't have the heart to tell her that I wanted more than service. I wanted to be the one giving the orders. From as early as I can remember, I was drawn to code. Not the ones printed in pink on puzzles for girls, but the real ones, encrypted military transmissions pattern, ciphers, foreign intercepts. While other kids watched cartoons, I watched my dad polish his medals and tried to decipher the Morse code etched on the old brass plaques in his study. By age 9, I was replicating field encryption models from his training manuals. At 10, I built a basic algorithm to break them. I'd sneak into his office at night, heart-pounding flashlight, clenched between my teeth, and trace the patterns like sacred scripture. He caught me once, hunched over his desk, scribbling variables on the back of an operations flowchart. I was so excited I couldn't breathe. "Look," I said, pointing at the solution I'd just unlocked. "This doesn't work with brute force. It folds on the second layer, so I rewrote the sequence." He didn't look at the paper. He just stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You were born with the wrong instincts," he muttered. "You're wasting time pretending you belong where you don't." That sentence stayed with me longer than it had any right to. At 12, he humiliated me at a backyard barbecue in front of his fellow officers. I had asked a question, just a question about Naval Academy entrance exams. He laughed, clapped a hand on my shoulder, and announced, "Claire here thinks she's going to join Naval Intelligence." Can you imagine? They laughed too, not cruelly, just out of habit. The idea was too absurd to entertain. I nodded, sipped my lemonade, and memorised the way the condensation slid down the glass. That was the moment I learned to smile through dismissal. That was also the moment I began building a world of my own. By 15, I had placed top 5 in a national cryptography competition, beating out a handful of college students along the way. The judges called me a prodigy. One retired codebreaker wrote me a personal letter. "Your mind works like a scalpel. We need minds like that." I never showed it to my parents. By then, I'd learned better. The quieter I was, the less it hurt when no one noticed. My mother once told me that my strength came from my silence. I wanted to tell her that my silence came from their strength, an overwhelming, immovable weight that never made space for mine. Zach, on the other hand, fit perfectly. Tall, athletic, obedient, and born with a natural talent for command. He was my father's pride in motion. When he announced at 17 that he wanted to try for SEAL training, Dad bought him a custom dive watch and gave him his old academy compass. When I got accepted into the Naval Academy, he didn't say a word. Actually, he did. He set down his coffee, looked me straight in the eye, and said, You'll crumble before Christmas. He even made a bet with Zach $500 that I wouldn't last 6 weeks. I was 17. I trained for years, aced every physical test, and scored nearly perfect on entrance exams. And all I wanted more than medals, more than money, was one proud smile. Instead, I got a wager. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I just nodded, excused myself, and went to my room, where I stared at the ceiling and promised myself one thing: I would never give them the satisfaction of watching me quit. That promise shaped everything, but it also carved something out of me, something I wouldn't understand until much later. Because when you live your life in silent rebellion, even your victories feel lonely. You stop celebrating. You stop explaining. You build your armor out of encryption keys and long hours and classified files. And when your father says she's sensitive, or your mother whispers she never really found her path, you let them, because correcting them would mean revealing how much you care. And I did care, desperately. But I was also learning that in families like mine, caring too visibly was just another invitation to be diminished. So I trained harder, ran longer, studied deeper. I turned my back on their silence and built something stronger inside mine. One day, I knew that silence would break, and I would be the one standing, not waiting for applause, just standing, unshakable. One day I knew that silence would break, and I would be the one standing, not waiting for applause, just standing, unshakable. The first real crack came in the form of a white envelope with gold lettering, United States Naval Academy Admissions Office. Inside was the offer I had worked for years to earn full acceptance top of my class recommendation letters from instructors who called me the most promising candidate they'd ever taught. I held that letter like a lifeline, like proof I wasn't crazy to dream beyond the script written for girls in my family. I brought it to the dinner table, laid it down between the mashed potatoes and the usual silence, and waited for anyone to look at me differently. My mother blinked, gave me a soft smile, and asked if I needed help packing. My father set down his fork, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Annapolis, huh? It'll chew you up and spit you out. You're not built for that kind of pressure." Then, almost as an afterthought, he reached into his wallet, peeled out $500 and slid it across the table to Zach. "Bet you she drops out before October." Zach chuckled like it was all a joke, just harmless fun. I looked at the money, crisp and smug, and said nothing. What was there to say? I knew how this worked. In our house, belief was rationed, and I had never been on the list. The night before I left, Mum hovered around my room folding clothes. I'd already packed, her voice low and uncertain. "You don't have to do this, Claire. You're so bright. You could study something safer. Teaching, maybe." She didn't mean harm. She never did. That was what made it harder. Her concern was real. Her love is genuine. But it was the kind of love that kept you tethered to the shore instead of teaching you to swim. I nodded, kissed her cheek, and zipped my bag. No one came with me to Annapolis. 6 hours on a Greyhound, clutching that envelope like armour, watching towns blur past while families hugged their sons at departure gates. No handshake from Dad, no slap on the back from Zach. Just a bus ticket and a promise I'd made to myself I would not crawl back. Not broken, not small. I arrived alone, blending into a sea of hopeful cadets, with fresh buzz cuts and wide eyes. The academy gates stood like a challenge, steel, and ceremony. My heartbeat in code, Zu I will know 1, on, off, fight, flight. When they called my name at orientation, I heard a pause. Then, a murmur. "Donovan. Isn't that Admiral Donovan's daughter?" The laughter was polite, but I felt the weight of the shadow trailing me in. Everyone knew who he was. Nobody knew who I was. That was fine. I didn't come to be known. I came to win. And win I did. By the end of our first quarter, I was leading every academic metric. Highest mark in cryptology, top 2% in tactical simulation. I passed the physicals with little sleep and bruised knees running until my lungs tore open. Every morning at 500, I was the first on the track. Every night at 2300, the last one in the strategy lab. Not because I needed to prove anything to them, but because the voice of my father still echoed in my mind, "You'll crumble before Christmas." I carried that sentence like a stone in my boot. Let it blister, let it scar, it kept me moving. But no matter what I did, the letters I sent home returned with the same shallow praise. "Good to hear you're staying busy," Dad wrote once. "Zach is thinking of enlisting. We're so proud." No mention of my awards, no questions about my rank, just the unshakable sense that I was a placeholder in their lives. Something to be tolerated, not celebrated. When the first semester ended, I was named top of the class. The commander gave me a commendation. My instructors pulled me aside and asked if I'd considered officer school after graduation. I smiled, said thank you, walked back to my dorm, and sat alone in the dark. No family phone call, no congratulatory dinner, just silence. Again. But this time it didn't burn. It clarified. Because I realised something that night. They weren't just waiting for me to fail. They needed me to. My success didn't fit their story. A Donovan daughter wasn't supposed to outshine the sons. She was supposed to cheer from the bleachers, make casseroles, clap politely, fade. But I wasn't built for fading. I was built for impact. And so when the second year rolled around and things got harder, grueling drills, impossible codes, live-fire simulations that left your ears ringing, I didn't flinch. I leaned in. Every insult, every underestimation, every raised eyebrow became fuel. And while others dropped out or plateaued, I sharpened. They still didn't see me coming, but they would. One day. And when that day came, I wouldn't say a word. I'd just stand. Exactly where they said I never would. But that day almost never came. It was during a live tactical drill on a freezing morning in February when everything nearly fell apart. We were simulating a close-quarters combat breach under pressure, heavy packs, smoke grenades, and comms disruption. The kind of chaos was designed to see who would crack. I was the team lead, first through the door. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was that someone had tampered with my gear. My rifle's optics were misaligned, my harness partially unfastened, and the explosive simulation charge meant to breach the door, placed just inches too close to my position. When it detonated, the shockwave flung me backward. I hit the tarmac hard head, ringing ribs, aching breath gone. For a split second, I thought I was dying. And in that moment of silence, where the world felt distant and muffled, I heard it. My father's voice clear as day from years ago. "You'll crumble before Christmas." For the first time, I let that voice feel real. Let the doubt seep in. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was pretending. Maybe I had pushed too far for too long just to prove a point that didn't matter to anyone but me. As medics rushed in and the crowd of instructors yelled over each other, I lay there, eyes on the grey sky, and whispered, "Is this it?" The question wasn't about death, it was about worth. Was this all just stubbornness dressed up as strength? They ran tests. Concussion. 2 cracked ribs. Temporary hearing loss. "Sit out for 3 weeks, the medic said. "You're lucky, could have been worse." I nodded numb. But the worst part wasn't physical. It was the paperwork that followed, the subtle whispers, the shrugging comments from fellow cadets. "Should have stayed in the lab, Donovan. Maybe she's not built for the field." Even the instructors didn't ask too many questions. There was no official investigation. No follow-up. Just a quiet assumption that maybe I wasn't cut out for the dirt and sweat of field command. That week was the closest I came to quitting. Not because of pain, but because I could hear their stories, I started to rewrite myself. The version where I had tried failed and quietly disappeared. The version where Dad was right. I spent long nights lying in my bunk, eyes open to the dark ceiling, replaying every moment, wondering what I missed, who did it. Because someone did, and they nearly succeeded. Then came Major Sinclair. He was new to the academy, gruff, blunt, with a voice like gravel and eyes that didn't blink. He called me into his office 2 days after the incident. "Sit," he said, barely looking up. "You're Claire Donovan, top 3 in cyber warfare simulations. Fastest decryption rate in 3 years. But here you are, almost blown to pieces." I waited, expecting dismissal. Or worse, pity. Instead, he slid a folder across the desk. "You know what this is?" I opened it. "A complex layered encryption protocol designed for joint force operations. Unsolved. No one's cracked it yet," he said. "Want to try?" I blinked. "Sir," he leaned forward, "I read your profile. You don't belong in anyone's shadow. But if you want to lead in the real Navy, you have to learn 2 things: how to bleed without breaking, and how to see 10 steps ahead while everyone else is still reading the map." From that day, Major Sinclair took me under his wing. Not with encouragement, but with fire. He pushed harder than any instructor before him. No shortcuts, no allowances. He dragged me into extra training at Euro 500, forced me to explain code on a whiteboard while holding a plank position. Assigned mock missions that made real drills feel like child's play. Pain is the tuition, he'd bark. You want a seat at the table, pay it. But under the barking, there was respect. And for the first time, someone in uniform saw me not as a mistake, not as a footnote, but as potential. He never once asked about my father, never mentioned Zach. To him, I wasn't a Donovan legacy. I was just Claire. And that made all the difference. One night, after a brutal simulation that left half my team wiped out on paper, I stayed back to rerun the strategy. I didn't notice Sinclair watching from the shadows. When I finally got it right, when every move synchronized and the outcome flipped, he stepped forward and said, "That's what command looks like. Not flashy, not loud, relentless." By the time I returned to active training, something in me had changed. My body still ached. My hearing still rang. But my center, it was steel. And when I walked back into formation, I didn't need anyone to clap. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to become undeniable. Then, just 2 weeks into my recovery rotation, it happened. Another training accident. A misstep on an icy trail during a high-speed endurance descent. My foot twisted under a jagged rock, and my wrist, my dominant hand, snapped with a sharp crack that silenced my scream. They said it was a compound fracture, surgery, pins, a cast that would stay for months. I was benched. Again. But this time, it wasn't just physical. The pain lived deeper. I was 21 and already collecting scars like merit badges. I tried to take it as another test, another chance to grow. But isolation has a way of unspooling you slowly. There's only so much grit you can muster alone in a sterile recovery wing, eating dry toast and staring at motivational posters that mean nothing at 2 a.m. I wrote home. For the first time in months, I reached out, not with bitterness, not with pride, just a simple note. Got hurt again, out for 8 weeks, still holding strong, hope Zach's doing well. I waited. A week passed, then 2. What came wasn't a letter, it was a card. One of those pre-printed ones you pick up at a pharmacy. Thinking of you. Get well soon. No handwriting, no message, just their names scribbled in black ink at the bottom like a signature on a lease. And I realised I was facing this alone, fully, undeniably alone. No one was coming. Not from home, not from blood. And that was the moment something shifted. I stopped waiting. The cast itched. The pain was constant. but I refused to let it be the end. I took the PT schedule and rewrote it, made a version I could do one-handed. Balance drills, isometric holds, left arm strength reps. When no one was watching, I did slow, trembling push-ups on my knuckles, sweat pouring down my neck, rage and clarity burning in equal parts. The nurses told me to rest. The doctors said healing would take time. But I couldn't afford to wait. Every hour not moving felt like slipping backward into their version of me. Delicate, fragile, optional. The emotional toll cut deeper than the physical. I missed the feel of a weapon in my hand, the satisfying rhythm of code at midnight. I missed the purpose. But most of all, I missed being seen. Not admired, just seen, acknowledged, like I mattered. And it was during that low point that I learned the harshest truth of all, even the strongest heart fractures when it beats alone too long. So I built a routine. I journaled in code writing encrypted thoughts only I could unlock. I learned to eat with my left hand. I mapped my own nerve recovery and tracked it in spreadsheets. I read every declassified ops report Sinclair ever referenced. I became my own rehab specialist, my own mentor, my own lifeline. If they wouldn't write me back, I would write myself forward. One evening, a junior nurse caught me doing planks with my legs elevated and my cast pressed awkwardly into a pillow. "You'll tear the stitches," she said, almost panicked. I looked up, sweat dripping from my hairline. "Then I'll sew them back." She didn't know what to say. Neither did I. But in that moment, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at the injury. Not even to my family. I was just done asking for space in their story. I would write my own. When I was finally cleared to remove the cast, my right arm looked foreign, shrunken, pale stiff. The orthopedic tech smiled politely, handed me a basic rubber ball and said, "Just take it easy. Strength comes back slowly." I thanked him, went back to my barracks and threw the ball against the wall 100 times until my arm screamed in protest. I wasn't interested in easy. I didn't want to be slow. I wanted everything they thought I couldn't reclaim. At night, I dreamed of the accident. Not the fall, but the sound. That sickening, decisive snap that split me open. I'd wake up sweating, grasping at the air, testing my grip, like it was proof I still belonged here. And each morning, I rose earlier. Each night, I pushed further. I wasn't chasing medals anymore. I was chasing silence, the kind that comes when no one doubts you because they've run out of reasons. In the mirror, I began to see someone new. Someone with fewer illusions, more control. I wasn't invincible, but I was inevitable, and that, I learned, was more powerful than either. My graduation came with no banners, no cheering section in the stands, just a silent nod from Major Sinclair as he passed me my certificate, a hand on my shoulder heavier than any medal. "You'll be hearing from someone soon," he said. I didn't ask who, I just saluted. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a courier with no insignia. "Claire Donovan," it read. "Report to Fort Meade. Clearance level Ultra. Assignment, Naval Cyber Command, Black Cell." No other information, just coordinates, a date, and the quiet thrill of being chosen for something most never even hear about. I packed my things without ceremony. There was no farewell party, no photos with classmates, no one to wave goodbye. I left a folded note on my bunk for the next cadet. "Earn it." That was all. The facility at Fort Meade wasn't marked. It sat behind layers of biometric gates and reinforced concrete guarded not by rifles but by silence. My orientation lasted 10 minutes. A briefing officer scanned my ID, nodded, and led me through a labyrinth of steel doors into what they called the core. Inside were rows of terminals, wall-sized data displays, and men and women with eyes that had seen things the world would never read in headlines. My new uniform had no name tag. My missions had no log. But the stakes were the world. I started by auditing active threats, dissecting malware strains, capable of collapsing entire power grids, tracing digital fingerprints of cyber cartels, and rerouting attack packets in real time. Within weeks, I was leading my own cell. We worked in 10-hour shifts, slept in quarters so secure even our dreams felt classified. I missed the sun, but I didn't miss the silence of my childhood home. In this silence, I was necessary. They called us ghosts, operators who knew where every vulnerability lived but were never seen fixing it. The success of our missions was measured in disasters that never happened. A hospital that kept its lights on, a city that didn't lose water, a plane that never fell. And yet, my family thought I was working IT support in some Navy base office. Still playing with your computers, Zach joked once during a rare phone call. You should see what real fieldwork looks like. I smiled, said nothing. Because what would be the point? Tell them about the Iranian satellite we hijacked to trace back a digital bomb, about the time I disarmed a ransomware attack on the DoD's internal network, using nothing but command line code and 2 cups of vending machine coffee. No, they wouldn't hear it. They'd call it luck. They'd call it exaggerated. Or worse, they'd nod and then ask if Zach's deployment papers had come through. So, I chose silence. Again. Not out of shame, but strategy. I didn't need their applause. I had clearance levels they couldn't pronounce. I had passwords that opened doors they didn't know existed. And I had a team who didn't care who my father was, only whether I could see the breach before it happened. I could. I always could. There were nights, of course, when I ached for something simple. A dinner where I didn't have to lie about where I'd been. A call from Mum that didn't end with her reminding me how proud they were of Zach. I kept every card they sent, even the ones with no handwriting. I didn't reread them. I just stacked them in a drawer marked unsent files. And yet, some part of me still hoped that maybe one day they'd see a headline, catch a whisper, connect a dot, realize their daughter wasn't a ghost. But I knew better. They'd just ask if I'd seen the news, if it affected real work. When I got my promotion to colonel, there was no ceremony, just a secure message, a new access level, and a note from Sinclair. Told you, inevitable. I stared at the screen for a long time that night. Then, I closed it, poured a coffee, and went back to work. Because I wasn't built for applause. I was built for aftermaths, for intercepting the worst before it could touch the innocent, for choosing to be invisible so the world could keep spinning. Let them say I worked in IT. They weren't wrong. They just never asked what kind. By the time I turned 31, I was the youngest colonel in the history of Naval Cyber Command. They called it unprecedented. I called it overdue. My unit, Black Cell, wasn't on any official roster, but the lives we saved echoed in empty boardrooms, where cyber attacks never landed. We rerouted missile codes, dismantled insurgent communications, and once in a 12-hour blitz collapsed an entire darknet trafficking ring without firing a single bullet. I remember sitting alone in Ops Room B, 3 screens glowing in cascading code fingers, blistered from typing eyes, raw body unmoving. The final trace hit. I exhaled. Then, silence. No cheer, no medals, just the gentle hum of a world we had just saved, none the wiser. It was in those halls of silence where I met Ethan Reese. CIA, though he'd never admit it outright. His clearance matched mine, his gaze saw too much. We collided over an intercepted payload. His agency wanted to trace it. Mine wanted to kill it. Our argument at 2 a.m. in a bunker deep beneath Norfolk was so sharp and fast, the room felt like it cracked with static. And yet, something passed between us. A recognition. 2 phantoms in the same war, fluent in secrecy and fluent somehow in each other. Our first date was a debrief. Our second, a threat analysis meeting. By the third, we were drinking lukewarm whiskey in a surveillance van parked outside an embassy gala trading worst-case scenarios, like love letters. He never asked about my family. Never asked what they thought I did. He just looked at me, really looked and said, "You don't flinch. That's rare." We got married inside a restricted base in Virginia. No white dress, no vows, just a judge, a file number, and our fingerprints inked side by side. He gave me a ring engraved not with our names, but with a string of hexadecimal code. "You'll know what it means when you need to," he said. I decoded it later. It read chosen, not given. That was Ethan. Sharp-edged love wrapped in cipher. My parents didn't attend. They didn't know. Or maybe they did and chose silence again. When Zach heard through someone else, he texted me, "Married, wow, does he know what he's in for?" I stared at the screen, deleted the message. I didn't reply. Our marriage was built not on grand gestures, but on understanding. We both disappeared for weeks without explanation. We left notes in ciphers that only we could read. We fought sometimes, not about the work, but about what it cost. "Do you ever miss being known?" he asked once lying on the floor after a 14-hour operation. I didn't answer, just looked at the ceiling. The truth was, I did, but not enough to give up what I had built. I was part of a machine designed to prevent collapses, and I'd become so good at being unseen that the idea of being visible felt dangerous. One night, we traced a digital worm to a server in Istanbul. The code was elegant, layered, and fast, a virus designed to infect critical infrastructure across Europe. We had minutes, I called it, ordered a silent trace burn and override. Ethan hesitated. "That'll burn the source. We lose the ability to track it back." I shook my head. "We lose cities if we wait." We won, but it cost us intel. And in the post-op debrief, my superiors questioned the call. "Aggressive," one said. "Premature," another. Sinclair sent a single line reply. She was right, again. The file closed. That's how most of it went. I made decisions. Some unpopular, all necessary. I had no statues, no speeches, but I had clear skies over cities that never knew how close they came to disaster. And at night, when Ethan and I sat side by side in the dark, sometimes not even touching, just breathing, I knew I had made the right trade. I had chosen a life not of applause, but of impact. And still, some nights I reread that card from my family. The one with no words. Just names. I didn't resent them anymore. I just understood. Some people can only love what they recognize. And I had made myself unrecognizable. But I wasn't lost. I was the blade in the code. The silence before the firewall held. The last unseen hand before the lights stayed on. I wasn't just their daughter. I was their shield, even if they never knew. And yet, I came back. Not to reclaim anything, not even to confront. Just to observe. Zach's promotion to SEAL Lieutenant was scheduled for the following Saturday. Coronado Base. The same hall where names echoed with valor and medals pinned became a legacy. My parents would be there beaming. My mother in pearls. My father in that same starched navy suit that once intimidated entire brigades. I debated not going. Ethan even asked gently, "Do you need to see them to prove you exist?" I shook my head, half laughing. "No, I just want to see if they notice I'm already here." The day arrived, crisp Californian sun, slanting over the base like a floodlight. I wore a civilian blazer, again, navy plain calculated. No uniform, no bars, just presence. I stepped into the auditorium 5 minutes early, walked past the back rows where civilian guests clustered, and slid into a chair near the edge. I didn't want attention. I wanted proximity. To watch them see me and still not see. The ceremony began with music, brass-heavy, majestic. Zach stood tall on the platform, eyes forward, the very image of what a Donovan should be. The MC read his citations. Operations completed. Endurance records, team leadership. My father clapped first, loud and proud. My mother wiped a tear. I sat, still, fingers interlaced, heart oddly quiet. Then the whispers started. 2 rows ahead, a former SEAL instructor nudged another and muttered, "Isn't that Claire? Thought she dropped out years ago." A woman, maybe his wife, tilted her head. "She's the one who went into tech or something, support staff." Another snorted. "Probably network admin at some base in San Diego. Must be nice. Air-conditioned courage." I didn't flinch. I didn't need to. The insult was so small it couldn't touch the years I'd built in fire. But what did sting, what always did, was the silence beside them. Zach turned slightly, heard it. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened. But he didn't speak, didn't glance back, just stood there unmoving, as if not hearing was easier than correcting, as if neutrality costs less than truth. My inner voice whispered what I wouldn't say aloud. "You know what I do, Zach. You've known for years." But the room is safer when I remain the myth they dismiss. The chaplain closed the ceremony with a prayer. For those who serve in body, mind and code. My breath caught at that last word. It was rare, almost accidental. A nod to the wars we fight without bullets. I waited. Hoped. No reaction. My father nodded solemnly. My mother adjusted her scarf. Zach bowed his head. No one looked at me. When the applause faded and the brass exited, families surged forward. Photos, laughter, the easy affection of being celebrated. I stayed seated, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to see if anyone noticed the stillness behind the storm. Eventually, Zach approached, alone. His uniform gleamed under the overhead lights, but his eyes didn't meet mine. "Hey," he said, voice low like someone approaching a sleeping dog. "Didn't think you'd come." I smiled faintly. Neither did I. A pause. He scratched the back of his neck. "They don't mean anything by it. Those guys, I mean." I raised an eyebrow. "Which part? The jokes about my job, or the part where you didn't stop them?" He exhaled. "It's complicated." "No," I said, standing slowly, keeping my tone neutral. "It's actually very simple. You had a choice, and you made it." He looked down. "You know how Dad is, how he sees things. That's not an excuse, Zach. It's a legacy, and you're either breaking it or you're carrying it on your back." He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, I didn't know what to say. I stepped closer, voice soft but unshakable. "You say, that's my sister, and you have no idea what she's done. You say, she's the reason some of your missions didn't end in funerals. Or, if that's too hard, you say nothing, but you don't laugh. You don't look away." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." I nodded once, "So am I." Then I turned, walked back down the aisle of uniforms and oblivion, past families wrapped in congratulations, past the people who would remember me only as the girl who came alone, didn't clap and left early. But I didn't walk away bitter. I walked away free, because that day wasn't for me, but the next one might be. The next ceremony came quicker than I expected. It was at Coronado again, only this time the guest list was different. General Sullivan was presiding, and the auditorium crackled with the kind of electricity that only comes when something unscripted is about to break precedent. I was there because I had to be. Not as Claire the ghost, not as sister or daughter, but because duty had called us both into the same room, and this time I wouldn't slip away. I stepped through the doors in full dress uniform, colonel insignia, polished against a crisp navy coat trousers, edged with the precise ivory stripe of rank. I didn't need to state my name, my posture did. My arrival hushed the room, drawing every head. I moved toward the front, weaving between family clusters and ceremony staff until I stood at the side of the stage, just out of sight of the audience, but in full view of those on stage. General Sullivan, mid-sentence, paused. He looked out at the ranks, then up toward the side table where my folded coat lay, and his eyes found mine. He faltered, as if the speech had tripped over a hidden wire. The microphone caught the hitch in his voice. He cleared his throat, stepped away from the podium, and broke protocol in a way that echoed louder than any spoken announcement. Colonel Donovan. His voice carried across the hall like thunder behind calm skies. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the whirring of distant air systems. Then, shock. Eyes widened in the audience. Silence. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Families shifting uniforms, adjusting a dozen ceremonies, pausing mid-ritual. My heart pounded in rhythm with their surprise, but my face betrayed nothing. And then, stillness. Even the air felt paused, waiting. On the edge of that stage, I saw Dad's jaw drop. Mum's hands gripped each other tight. Zach froze, mid-breath caught between recognition and denial. They were silent, suspended in disbelief at the shape of their assumptions now undone. Around them, the room exhaled softly, stunned, but captivated. General Sullivan corrected his stance, regained his composure and returned to the mic, but he did not adjust his speech. Now, he spoke into a changed moment. As he continued, every word carried new gravity. I stood at attention, unmoving, embodying the weight of unspoken battles and unclaimed truths. Not for applause, not for them, but because being seen finally was its own victory. Banja noi van shuajat mustiut histuliu. Ban kodemorong them chat GPT janoi toi siviet laituan bofan noi. Vomat tren sang kauji jam baojat toi tiu chat tu giu jung, gyongke, shiu sao noitem. Ket noi mak lak voi fan trok jung. Toi tau kau trau kam suk jung nhuban mong mon. But I didn't walk away bitter. I walked away free. Because that day wasn't for me. But the next one might be. I didn't know it would come so soon. A follow-up ceremony was scheduled just 2 weeks later, something formal, high-level, more brass than blood. General Mark Sullivan was set to present an award for strategic operations in the Pacific Theatre. A plaque, a ribbon, a photo op. I was technically just there as a supporting officer. One of many names buried in the logistics. But someone, somewhere, must have nudged a detail. Because my name was on the attendance log. Full dress requested. No explanation given. I almost ignored it. Ethan raised an eyebrow when I mentioned it. You think this is a coincidence? I shook my head. I think someone's setting the table, and maybe it's time I stop eating in the hallway. So I went. The Coronado Base Auditorium looked the same, but this time I didn't slide into the shadows. I walked through the front entrance uniform, crisp heels, precise eyes forward. My colonel bars gleamed under the downlights, and I carried nothing but a small clutch and the quiet certainty that I had at last stopped folding myself to fit inside their blind spots. Families murmured as I passed. Officers turned, paused. A few saluted out of reflex. One young ensign stiffened, then whispered to his seatmate, "Is that? Wait, that's her. I saw my family before they saw me. Second row centre aisle, Dad at the end spine, straight as ever. Mum in pale grey pearls tucked under a silk scarf. Zach beside them, arms crossed, jaw set. I paused at the edge of their vision and simply waited. When the band ended its opening number, the announcer took the mic. Please rise as we welcome General Mark Sullivan, Commanding Officer, Pacific Defense Coordination. Applause. The rustling of suits and medals. General Sullivan stepped up to the podium, all squared shoulders and speech-ready charm. Then it happened. He looked out at the audience, glanced toward the seating chart on the teleprompter, and froze. His gaze lifted to the far right of the stage, where I stood at parade rest just behind the curtain. His breath hitched. He blinked. Then, into the hot live microphone, he said it, Colonel Donovan, 3 syllables. That's all it took. The auditorium stalled like someone had unplugged the moment. A collective intake of breath, sharp and sudden. Heads turned like dominoes. My father's neck craned so fast I could hear the catch in his throat. My mother dropped her program. Zach. God, even Zach went rigid. The entire second row stared at me as if I'd stepped out of a myth they'd long buried. My heels echoed as I stepped forward into the light. Sullivan left the podium, descending 2 steps, hand extended not as a formality, but with something startlingly close to reverence. I didn't know you'd be here, he said under his breath, lips barely moving. I returned the handshake voice calm. Neither did I, but I figured, it's time. He nodded. Just once. Then turned back to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll begin in a moment. But first, allow me to acknowledge someone I owe more than most will ever know. Colonel Claire Donovan of Naval Cyber Command. Her work over the last 5 years has directly contributed to the operations we're honouring today. It wasn't planned, it wasn't scripted, and yet it was perfect. The silence afterward was more telling than applause could ever be. Every eye flicked to me, then to my family, then back again. My father's face had flushed 3 distinct shades: confusion, disbelief, and something dangerously close to fear. My mother's hand clutched her pearl strand like a rosary. Zach didn't move, just stared. I didn't smile, I didn't nod. I simply stood, still, solid, unflinching. The rest of the ceremony blurred. Commander introduction citation reading slideshows with grainy satellite images. I heard none of it. I was listening to the quiet unravelling in row 2, the whispered, "What the hell?" from someone behind me. The sharp exhale from my father when Sullivan referenced my unit again. The way Mum touched his knee under the programme, her fingers trembling. Zach leaned forward once, elbows on knees, then leaned back. No one spoke my name again that night, but no one forgot it either. When the ceremony ended, I made no move to approach them. I turned left instead toward the side exit. If they wanted to speak, they could find me. If not, I'd leave like I arrived, intact, invisible only by choice. But halfway to the door, a hand caught my sleeve. Zach. He looked at me differently now, not like a sister, not like a threat, but like someone staring down the version of history they'd tried so hard to erase. You really? He started, then stopped. I waited. He swallowed. You're the reason we had those new protocols in Baku, aren't you? The blackout op, the one nobody explained? I tilted my head just slightly. I'm a lot of reasons for things people don't explain. He nodded once. Then, softer. They'll never say it. But they know now. I didn't answer, because some truths don't need echoing. He let go. I walked away. And this time, it felt as if something had shifted, not just within them, but in the room itself. It was as if the air had rearranged to accommodate me properly, rather than asking me to shrink. That was the night the name Donovan meant something different. Not just to them. To me. The next morning, after the ceremony's echoes had faded into base routine, I made my way to the conference room, cradled behind the buzzing command offices, where Dad's office sat like a fortress of faded authority. The invitation, or was it a summons, arrived in the form of a curt text from my mother. They want to talk. Now. Together. I stepped inside to find them both waiting, their postures curled tight with every emotional extreme: shock, anger, betrayal. My father's uniform was stiff, but the seams on his shoulders drooped under the weight of unspoken fury. Mum's face was pale lips pressed so thin I could have drawn them in with a finger. Zach stood between them, shoulders squared, but eyes anxious like he'd spent the night in ambush. The door clicked shut behind me. Formality and finality. Claire Dad began, voice gone brittle, an echo of the firm commands he'd once issued, over saluting recruits. We need to know exactly what happened last night. Why did Sullivan announce you in front of everyone? His question was loaded with accusation, dread, and something I hadn't heard in years, vulnerability. I took a measured breath. I did what I always do, I said, voice calm tone, even I showed up. Because I'm here. I'm here and I've been here and I stand by what I've built. I watched them absorb the words like they were foreign currency. Mum's brow furrowed, her inhale sharp with something like sorrow. You made them, us, look like fools, Dad's voice cracked. You undermined tradition. You threw our legacy into question. Tradition and legacy were words I'd heard my whole life, the mooring chains that bound me to roles I refused. I folded my arms, looked each of them in the eye. I didn't throw anything I said. I just gave truth a stage. My father's lip curled. Truth. You call this truth, parading your secret career in front of a packed audience. When I met his gaze, I saw all the old dismissal. A man whose career was built on service in plain view, suddenly blindsided by something he couldn't process. I swallowed. I stayed silent for years. I let you believe I was someone I never was. I did it because it was easier. But easier isn't always right. I'm not here to apologize for being necessary. My words landed hard. Mum closed her eyes, pressed a hand to her mouth. Zach shifted, his eyes never leaving mine. My father inhaled, slammed a fist lightly against the table. The jarring sound echoed off the glass walls. You embarrassed me, he said, voice low but trembling. Our sons, they depend on me. He turned to Zach, seeking solidarity, but found only hesitation. Zach's shoulders dropped. In that instant, the weight of their expectations lifted away. Not mine, theirs. Mum's hands trembled as she reached for a tissue. I saw the conflict etched in her face. Love for me, fear of fallout, centuries of tradition screaming for suppression. I'm not embarrassed, I said gently. I'm grateful that Sullivan acknowledged what I've always done. And if that embarrasses you, then maybe it's time for me to carry that weight instead of hiding. My parents flinched. I pressed on. I held open doors you didn't know existed. I caught threats before they spread. No one died. No hospitals lost power. No cities went dark. I did this on behalf of what you taught me, service excellence, but you never recognized why. The room held its breath. Even Zach looked smaller, his gaze fixed on the table. My father ran a hand through his hair. Mum's tears fell quietly now, as though release had been too long delayed. I turned to Zach. His jaw clenched. Hey, I said quietly, stepping closer, voice soft. You okay? He met my eyes, blinked back at me. I knew, he said, voice rough. I always did. But I felt powerless. I couldn't protect you from their reaction or ours. I studied him. You thought it was safer to stay silent. I did, he admitted, eyes downcast. But I was wrong. He looked up. They were wrong. A fragile moment, but theirs, not mine. My father cleared his throat, exhaled. Claire, he said, voice quieter now. This changes things. All of it. But I need you to understand why I felt betrayed. I nodded, acknowledging the hurt. And I need you to understand why I couldn't stay silent any longer. The room tilted toward a new axis. Not reconciliation yet, but recognition. Dad's shoulders sagged. Mum wiped her cheeks. Zach stepped between us, looked from me to Dad and said quietly, We're family, even if we can't stand the shape of it yet. I offered him a nod. Then, let's decide what shape we become after this. Silence followed, heavy, honest. And in that silence, for the first time, I realized our family had crossed a threshold. We were no longer bound by scripts of expectations. We were face to face with truth, with consequences, and I dared hope with choice. The next morning, I returned to my quarters, the light outside unusually soft, as if even the sky was learning to take a breath. My inbox blinked. Among the encrypted briefings and operational updates was a single civilian message from Zach. No subject line, just one line of text, requesting debrief, ma'am. I stared at it, not for the content, but for the word. Ma'am, not sis, not Claire. A recognition wrapped in protocol, stripped of irony. My thumb hovered before I typed back, approved. But you're buying the coffee. No emoji, no signature. Just a message exchanged between equals. That afternoon, a bouquet arrived at my door. Not red roses or lilies, but something quieter, blue irises. White calla lilies, a single stem of silver thistle. It wasn't the flowers that stopped me. It was the card tucked beside them, handwritten. My mother's cursive, unmistakable, for the strength we didn't know how to name. Love, Mom. I didn't cry, but I did sit down. The kind of sit that doesn't mean exhaustion, but grounding. I held the note for a long time, reading it over and over, as if each loop of her letters carried a different apology. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough to undo years of being unseen. But it was real. And for the first time, it was hers. Dad, predictably, stayed silent. No message, no flowers, no new words. But silence can mean different things. That evening, I saw him outside the officer's mess, standing in line for coffee alone. He didn't see me at first. Then his eyes met mine. No salute, no smile, just a nod. A single, deliberate civilian nod. I returned it. We didn't speak, but in that small, untheatrical exchange, I felt something shift again. He saw me, not as his daughter, not even as a colonel, just as someone who had earned her place. Maybe not in his way, but in her own. Days passed, then weeks, and while the world outside spun on threats, intercepted networks, hardened lives protected in silence, something in my personal orbit rebalanced. Zach sent me a photo of his new team, their deployment kits packed, standing under the early morning haze. Beneath it, he wrote, "They say we've got better protocol than last year." "Thanks for that," I replied. "Keep your head down and your ports closed." He replied with a laughing emoji and a salute. It wasn't closure, not yet. But it was contact. And sometimes that's the more honest miracle. My mother started calling once a week. The conversations were still clumsy, full of tangents and safe questions. "What are you reading? How's the weather? Did you see the eclipse?" But every call ended with something new. "Be safe, Claire." Not "take care." Not "don't work too hard." But "be safe." A phrase reserved for those who walked near danger. Who mattered? Who weren't just playing with computers in air-conditioned rooms. I didn't tell her where I was. I couldn't. But I told her what I was cooking. What book was I rereading? I asked about her garden. And when she mentioned she'd started using Signal for messaging, Zach helped me install it, I nearly laughed. "You're becoming operational," I said. She chuckled. "Well, someone in this house has to keep up with you two." Dad still hadn't spoken since that day in the conference room. But then, 2 months later, a package arrived. No note, just a box. Inside it was his old academy compass, the one he gave Zach when he enlisted. And underneath it, wrapped in a military-issue cloth, was his first encrypted field manual from 1978. I held it in my hands and felt the weight of two things, legacy and surrender. I didn't need him to say the words. That was the thing about families like ours. Sometimes the most profound apologies were wordless. Sometimes they came wrapped in memories you weren't supposed to inherit. And that's how the healing began. Not with grand declarations, but with slow acknowledgements. A text, a flower, a shared article, a compass. Little fragments of belonging returned piece by piece until they formed something like home. Not the home I had left, but maybe the one I could help rebuild. On my terms, in my name. Donovan. Yes, but not defined by theirs anymore. That's why, when the formal invitation arrived, Department of Defense embossed seal, full military protocol, I didn't hesitate. The location was unexpected. Washington, D.C., the Eisenhower Executive Building. Not a battlefield hangar or secretive basement, but a stage carved for legacy. The award was rare whispered in policy briefings, more than press releases the Meridian Cross for strategic impact, given for actions that prevented mass-scale devastation through unseen intervention. I had read the criteria once in passing, never considering myself its candidate. But someone somewhere had seen, and now they wanted to make it known. I flew in under my own name, no cover. Ethan met me at the hotel with 2 coffees and a quiet grin. "You ready to be seen?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, buttoning my coat. More than ever. The ceremony began at noon. By 11:30, the atrium was full. Rows of dignitaries, defence leaders, and a few foreign representatives in crisp dress. And among them, in a reserved family row near the front, sat my parents. My mother wore navy again, the same pearl earrings. My father's posture was familiar, rigid, disciplined, but his gaze moved more slowly now, not scanning for weakness, but tracking presence. Zach sat beside them, uniformed and silent, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. They didn't wave, but they looked. And this time, they didn't look through me. My name was called second, Colonel Claire Donovan, for extraordinary leadership in cyber operational defence, for preventing 3 near-catastrophic security breaches, and for exemplary command of classified operations vital to Allied interests. I walked to the stage, saluted with precision, and stood as the medal was pinned to my chest. Cameras clicked. Applause rang out. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I simply stood, visible, undeniable. The officer stepped back. "Colonel Donovan, if you'd like to address the assembly." I stepped forward. Not with a speech in hand, but with a breath I had waited a decade to take. "I'm honoured," I said, "but not just for this recognition. I'm honoured that the work we do in silence is beginning to be heard, that the battles waged in code are no longer invisible, and that those who were told they didn't belong did." I looked out then, not at the generals, but at the second row. My eyes found Zach first. He stood, slowly, deliberately, and saluted, not like a brother, but like an officer to a superior. My mother's hands flew to her mouth. My father rose next. He did not salute. He stepped forward at the edge of the audience line, broke every ounce of tradition, and extended his hand. I walked toward him, each step dissolving years of dismissal. We shook, firm and centered. He held my gaze. "Colonel," he said, "not Claire, not daughter, just the rank." I returned his stare and replied evenly clearly in front of the nation and history and every ghost that once sat on our shoulders. I did this because I deserved to, not because I needed permission. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The stillness that followed was louder than any ovation. It was the sound of something breaking open of silence, cracking of pride reshaping itself into respect. When I turned back to the stage, I saw Ethan in the corner, hands in his pockets, eyes warm. I nodded once. He nodded back. The ceremony continued. More names, more medals, more applause, but I had already received what I needed. Not the award, not the salute, but the right to exist fully in the light, on my terms, in my name. For everyone who's ever been underestimated, sidelined, or silenced, this was the answer. We don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes we just have to show up and stand where they said we couldn't. And when they ask how we got there, we answer simply, because I could. And maybe, just maybe someone watching needs to hear that too. So if you've ever been the silent one, the underestimated one, the invisible one, drop your story in the comments. This space is for us, for those who stayed quiet too long. for those who learn to stand anyway.